Hello, everyone. My name is Monis. I'm a sophomore studying business and comp sci, and I would love to present about the press release hackers. So, just a bit of background. I chose this topic because, as mainly a business student and economics student, I am interested in how computer security and hacking can affect things at a larger scale, on an economic level, business level, and this is a perfect example of that. So, let's head right into it. I always like to provide an agenda when giving a presentation. So, I'll walk you through all of these things. I'll introduce what actually happened, the motivation behind why I want you all to know about this particular topic, some of the attack vectors that these hackers use to get access to the confidential information, the consequences that happened for the attackers, but also as a whole to the economy and to other secondary and tertiary uh, consumers. And lastly, a conclusion with some of the key takeaways that I think are most relevant to this particular incident. Cool. So heading right into it. So these press release hackers is what the news services call them. And also, by the way, I have on the top right of the PowerPoint a key concepts thing. Some of them will have similar key concepts that I think relate back to Professor Stern's class and what we learned throughout the semester. But anyway, going back to the actual slide. So it was a group of Eastern European hackers, mostly Ukrainian, and and a trading network that they had, which actually spanned the entire globe. But obviously had more people in Eastern Europe as that's who they had connections to, and they would access unsecure press releases and utilize these to conduct illegal insider trading. And these concepts and some of these terms might be a little bit confusing at first, but I'll walk you through it. Don't worry about that. So this is a brief overview of what they did. I'm going to go more detailed in the next example. But essentially, they take press releases from news sites such as Business Wire and send these to their network of traders. And these traders, were decently rich people that could take these press releases and utilize it to conduct insider trading. And this is basically buying and selling stocks by knowing information that you shouldn't be knowing at all. And they would use this to make a lot of money in the stock market, and the hackers would receive a profit from that. So they'd probably, I think it was 40%. That was a number mentioned in the SEC, and they got a part of that profit. So here's an example of how this actually worked. So let's say Apple wanted to release a report, their earnings report, their quarterly earnings report at 3 p.m. So they send it over to Business Wire at 1 p.m. And this report actually has information about how Apple did that quarter, how much they earned, other information about them. And this is like a quarterly thing for all public companies. It's like pretty normal. But the thing is, if the hackers can get access to it, so let's say they get access to it at 2 p.m., then they have an hour to figure out what's going on. And if if it's a good earnings report, then they can buy Apple stock. So they give it to the traders. The traders are like, oh wow, Apple actually beat expectations and they earned a lot of money this quarter, which means their stock price is gonna go up a lot. So they buy a bunch of Apple stock. And when the press release gets released to the entire world is like, wow, Apple did really well. And they buy a lot of Apple stock and Apple's value goes up. And now the traders just made a lot of money from that piece of information. And this is obviously very illegal. The SEC will be all over this, but the hackers actually got away from it from 2012 to 2015, and this led to about 100 million in profits, I believe. So they actually got a huge amount of money, and that's why it was such a big deal. So the motivation for this, I think, is based around two things. One is a concept we learned in class, and it's that the attack surface is very important to consider. And another thing is that information can be useful in many different ways, and you have to be very understanding of that. So for example, the attack surface. So it doesn't matter if, a big company like Apple, the biggest company in the world, $2 trillion, that's their value. It doesn't matter if they have the best security in the world. They probably do, but that they can't guarantee that every single part of their partner companies and everybody related to them has that level of security. They can't guarantee that. And in this case, that just happened to be how it worked. So these newswire sites obviously don't have the level of security that Apple does. And this is not only a fault of Apple, it's also a fault of the newswire companies, also a fault of the government because they actually monitor this process since it is involved at an economic and market level, so they have to be involved in it. And none of them, like all of them, mess up a little bit in this. And so the attack surface was kept wide open. Also, another important thing to consider is that information can be useful in many different forms. Most most non-business people might think that press releases aren't really too big of a deal to grab a hold of beforehand, but obviously now that can be really valuable. And if you translate this into your lives, you remember like when you sign up for a password and you can put in like security questions like who was your first date or something like that. That could be, let's just say later on in Facebook you post like your memories of going on your first date and you don't really think back to how that could be useful. Well, that's a perfect way for a hacker to get information on that and utilize it to steal some of your passwords or reset your password. So this is just a way for you to think about more carefully what information could be useful to hackers and protect that carefully. So the way these hackers actually got in, there was three main methods that were mentioned in Wired, which is a newspaper that I got some of this information from. So two of these are kind of self-explanatory: phishing emails and data stealing malware. This is something that we've talked about in class as well. So essentially, phishing emails are just someone pretending to be someone that they're not. So an employee of these newswire sites could get an email saying that, pretending that it was from the head of the organization and saying, "Yo, sign into this link and this is required for work or something." So then the employee goes ahead and signs in, but it's actually not the head of the organization, it's the hackers, and now they have access to their password and their account information, and they can use that to steal data. Same with data stealing malware. These emails can come in with viruses, and as soon as you open the email, that can install the malware into your computer and steal data. SQL injections are a little bit different. Actually, we've touched on this in class in a different sort of way, so I'm going to go over this in a separate slide. But essentially, SQL injections, I think, are easily related to Heartbleed attacks. I think that's a close example of it. So essentially, it's taking a query to a database. So let's just say the user is requesting some information from a database. SQL injection is when you change that query to get more data out of it. So as similar to Heartbleed attack, you can maybe do a buffer error or ask for more data from the database. And when it sends it back, now they can have access to passwords, the press releases, and other information. So SQL injections are actually a pretty big topic in cybersecurity, something you should look into more as well. There are a lot of consequences from this. I'm going to hit on, primary, secondary, and tertiary ones. Primarily, of course, the economic market was influenced in ways that it should not have been, in illegal ways. Stocks moved up and down due to insider trading, and that is very illegal. The SEC will be on top of you for that. So that eventually, you will get caught. But that was, the primary concern. Secondarily, companies did get affected. If your stocks, moved up way too much or too low due to these traders conducting this trading at a high volume, then that's obviously going to affect your stockholders, your shareholders, and your company's value. It could be a negative or a positive way. Tertiary, political matters. Actually, Ukraine did not hand over the criminals when SEC caught them. Actually, Ukraine recruited them into their own government, and now these hackers are working for the Ukrainian government forcefully, I believe. So that tension created some tension, and there's always political matters at a cybersecurity level. You've probably seen it: USA, China, between other countries as well, USA, Russia. There's always things going on. So there were some changes, obviously, but I don't think there were enough. So these newswire sites got IT consultants. They also got help from the government to tighten security and beef up their security protocols. And the SEC was more involved with news-related attacks. They probably worked on their algorithms to monitor the trading networks to make sure if these press releases did affect any sort of market trading. But these are like standard changes. I think there definitely needs to be more done at a higher level. I think companies should be more careful in how they hand out press releases and data such as that. And I think the main conclusions I want you to get away from this, I've touched all of these throughout the slides, but I'm going to hit on it once again. I think if you think about the attack surface, I like to think of it like a wall, right? The larger the wall is, the bigger the wall is, the harder it is to monitor and maintain the entire wall. It's easy for someone to break through a little chink in the wall or find a way in. So reducing that can help prevent people accessing confidential information, making the wall smaller. I think also you need to consider how information is useful. As I mentioned before, something that you could consider is not harmful could be used in a possibly harmful manner. So just thinking about that actively. And lastly, globalization, especially in the past 20 years, past 20, 30 years, has made security such a bigger thing. It's not just one person trying to hack into like your YouTube account, your TikTok account. It can be so much more complex than that. Governments, extensive networks, and infrastructure can be involved. And that's actually huge. This is much bigger than anything you could possibly think about. So before I end it off, I hope that was a really helpful, presentation. You got to learn more about press release hacking and the economy. These are some basic questions. I think the first two are not too bad if you obviously listen to presentation. The third one is a bit more complex. I think this is something that you should think about for yourself and think about, why is cybersecurity so important? Why is it something I'm learning about in this class? And why is cybersecurity always emphasized? Because it is very complex. It involves a lot of infrastructure. So it's important to think about that. These are my sources, and that's it.